I do most things on computers, but when I was in high school, I did a lot of bread baking, and I continue to do it today, just because it's relaxing and it's actually a science. What I really like about it. So that's me with some pizza dough. That turned out to be a really good pizza. And I'm from this state, which is just an hour here. Go Red Sox. And I went to this public high school, and I did these things when I was in high school. Nothing really related to bread, but when I had time, when I had like an hour to do whatever I wanted, I baked bread. So this is one bread I made. I actually had a flour mill that was an attachment to a KitchenAid, if you guys know what a KitchenAid is. But you could basically buy seed and grind your own seed to make flour and like make some really, really beautiful breads, flavors that you would never get from a store-bought flour. This is a brioche loaf. Some really nice pans you can buy from some like King Arthur or whatever. And really get a nice sheen if you brush it with some butter. Well, it'll explain like the science behind how this actually works. Everything from bagels to scones to cinnamon buns. Sorry to tempt you guys. This is bad. And this is weird. I mean, I really like to experiment with things. And these are actually bagels too. And it was Christmas, and I was like, hey, why don't we just put food coloring in the bagels and make them all colorful? People ate them, so I mean, it worked out pretty well, I think. And for my senior project, I built a bread oven. So I found this book that says you can build your own bread oven as long as you have concrete and some bricks and whatnot. So for my senior year in high school, I built this bread oven. And the really nice thing about having a bread oven that's outside is that you can get to temperatures in the bread oven that you could never get in your conventional oven. I'm talking like 700, 800, 900 degrees. And that's only when you're going to get some perfect caramelization on the crust of the pizza. Usually not because how hot it is inside, but the radiation that's coming from the rocks really produces a nice crust. And that is me enjoying the pizza. So yeah. So like I said, I did my senior project on bread. And one of my thesis statements, I guess, was you should never buy store-bought bread because it's just awful. By the time they go through all the processing and putting preservatives and dough conditioners and all of these things that you don't know what they are, and then they produce this final bread. I actually brought some Wonder Bread in today for you guys to taste. It's not really bread anymore. I mean, it's kind of defeating the purpose. You're supposed to, you know, there's certain qualities of bread, like the crust, the crumb, does it melt in your mouth or is it tough? This is just kind of just like, meh. So the Wonder Bread guy, don't buy him. Or, I don't know, hopefully I don't offend anybody who's in the audience who works for the bread industry. Anyway, so I graduated early from high school. I went to Johnson & Wales for 3 months because I got into early to MIT. And I did everything from French culinary to baking and pastry to just how to make stocks and sauces out of like the bones and the cartilage of animals. Really, really cool stuff. And if you guys have like 3 months to do whatever you want, I really recommend it. Really, really good opportunity. And it was like 15 minutes from my house too, so that's kind of cool. And so I got to MIT and I was like, you know, I want to keep on baking and I want to do something good. And so I talked with the Public Service Center and I created this club my first year called the Baking Volunteer Club, which might have been in the brochure or something like that. But the idea is, you know, baking is fun. It's a nice like stress reliever and you can actually do good things with it. If you bake a lot, bread costs like 25 cents a loaf if you bake it from scratch. Then you can give it out to homeless shelters in Boston. That's exactly what we did. So every Friday we met like 6 or 7 students, places like the Boston Rescue Mission, St. Francis House, Women's Lunch Place. So we just donated these things. And you know, it satisfied my need to do public service, but also because I wanted to bake all the time too. Public service gave us money. Service Center at MIT gave us money, and yeah. And I do like math too. That's probably one of the reasons why I'm at MIT. And the Public Service Center said, like, well, we need to know exactly how much money you need because we can't just give you all the money you want. And so for some reason, I went to the store and I saw the grams of like each of the ingredients you could buy and basically found like the price per gram, the price per volume for all the ingredients. And so I knew exactly like a bread loaf would cost like 25.26 cents a loaf. I don't know why I did this, but I think it was kind of fun anyway. So yeah, I really got into it. And this is an example of what we produced. We had everything from breads, to cookies, you name it. And this is our largest donation. Those are all cinnamon buns, and that went to the Pine Street end, so it was all eaten too. Hard to believe. And the great thing about it is that we saw exactly where it went, right to the people, and see how it worked. So unfortunately, the Baking Volunteer Club doesn't exist anymore because MIT got to me and I needed to do all work in my computer. But I continue to do some stuff. It's a program called ESP at MIT that basically has younger students who are maybe in elementary school or middle school or high school come to MIT and learn whatever they want. So I've taught a couple of bread classes. And one thing called bread cred, I established a currency on my floor that I live in at MIT. So if someone does something nice to me or does something that's really cool, I'll give them a bread cred. It's basically equal to like a loaf of bread. So yeah, people knew me for my bread. It's a good thing. So let's get to the bread. Less about me. As you come here today, you're probably like, bread is this very mysterious thing. I don't want to touch yeast because maybe it'll explode. I don't know. The truth is it's not that bad. As long as you understand what's actually happening and the science behind it, it's less about following the recipe and more about knowing if this happens, why is it happening? And every time I bake, like with my friends who have never baked before at all, they're like, wow, that was easy. How did we just do that in like a couple hours? And then we have this really beautiful loaf of bread. And it's just kind of opening your eyes. So I kind of want to open your eyes to that as well so that when you go home, maybe you won't be as afraid to touching yeast. Or maybe some of you are bakers. Who's a baker here? Okay, cool. Okay, so we have a good number of bakers. So I have a challenge to say everything correctly now. Anyway, okay, so first, about baking. So when I went to culinary school, a lot of people were saying baking is the science. You have to measure it exactly to the gram. Like if you let the bread rise another 30 minutes, everything's going to be awful. And cooking is more of like, if you add these different flavors, you can try things out, and you can be more artistic, and like, even though everybody doesn't like my dish, I like my dish because I made it that way, so I'm an artist. But like, it's not true. I don't like saying this because baking is not pure science. There are things that you should follow and some things that you can deviate a little bit and change, which we'll go over later. But like, you don't want to put like 3 more tablespoons of baking powder in your thing and see how it works. There are limitations. You have to work within your limitations. But it is an art. It's not just a science. And so you come to this bread recipe. And this is, again, what I want to get across to you so that you can go home and say, I want to bake a loaf of bread. I'm not going to be scared. I'm going to grab this recipe, and I'm going to do exactly what it says. You could do that. You could do exactly what it says, and you'll probably come out with a nice-looking loaf of bread, maybe. But there are things in the recipe, like how you're supposed to do certain things, and it doesn't tell you why you're supposed to do those things. It's just like, yeah, do it and take it for what it's worth. And it'll probably come out with a nice-looking loaf. So I'm here to tell you more about why they tell you those things so that you can understand in your head why, like, it's telling me this because it wants to do this with the bread. And if I do it a different way, I could change the bread quality by this. So, you know, being the experimentalist, being the artist within the realm of baking. So, the ingredients of bread. So bread is a very, very simple thing. 4 major ingredients for the most like fundamental, basic, bread you want to think about. So flour. You find it in any supermarkets. But there are different types of flour. Not many people know about it. So, say if I wanted to bake like a scone, what type of flour do I want? I mean, you could always go with all-purpose. But a scone, you want maybe like a nicer, like a little softer, kind of melts in your mouth taste. So there are flours that are better for baking certain things. And the big variable with all these flours is this thing called gluten. Who's heard of gluten here? Okay. Gluten. So gluten is the protein found in flour. So if you want to think of protein as like strong and strength, the more protein you have in your flour, the tougher it's going to be. So if I wanted to have a scone that's nice and tender, I probably don't want to have a flour that has a lot of gluten in it. So the flour with the least amount of gluten is called cake flour. There's probably some really radical ones, but just say cake flour is the least. It's like 7%. Then there's all-purpose, which is like 8%. And if you want to make like a bread like this, you want to have some bite to it. You don't want it to just like fall apart because, well, I guess it depends what you want. But if you don't want it to fall apart, then you might want to use something called a bread flour, which is a little bit more than all-purpose, 9%. And then for the really tough things, like bagels, like you want to like tear it, and I don't know. I guess that's what bagels are supposed to be like. Or pretzels, or pizza. Pizza, you want a really tough crust so it can hold all the toppings and not fall apart on you when you're trying to pick it up. You want something that's really high flour content, and there's things called high gluten flour. You can't find in many places, but if you go to some specialty places, you can find some, and you can experiment with them. That doesn't mean that you can't use an all-purpose flour to make a pizza. That works perfectly fine, and you can actually change how you make the dough so that it works a little bit better for you, even though you don't have the extra gluten. So we can go over that as well later on. So that's flour. And OK, so salt. Salt is usually put things so that people can taste them more. Salt has more functions in bread. One other function in salt is that it strengthens the gluten. So if you put salt in your flour, the gluten later on, when it's trying to hold things together because it's trying to keep that strength, it'll do a better job. So the salt will help with that. The salt also helps something called retarding the yeast. So as yeast rises, it's like bread is a living thing. It's going to grow. If you don't want it to grow as fast, you could put more salt in. And so the salt is kind of like going to kill the yeast a little bit off. So if you omit the salt and your bread starts rising like crazy, that's you probably know why. Water is water, I guess. The reason why we add water is because it's actually very cool. So like I said, flour has gluten in it. But actually, it has two proteins. One's called glutenine, and the other one's called gliadine. Now, those proteins mix in order to form gluten. But the only way for them to do that is if you add water. So if you add water to the reaction of gluten and gliadine, then you get something called gluten. And that's why when you have flour and it's just all like, there's no strength in it at all. Once you add flour, it kind of becomes, it becomes a uniform mass. So that's the gluten coming into action. So water plays a very, very important role. And water is one of those things that you can actually vary the amount of. You add more water to dough, the gluten gets less strong because it's just oversaturated with water. And maybe if you wanted a very airy loaf or very tough loaf, you could add less water, and changing the water content varies the loaf very much. We can go over that later. And finally, yeast. Yeast is the quintessential golden token of bread. This is why it works. And yeast is what makes the bread a living thing. You think like you're just making a dish. It's not really a living thing. Like maybe there's some bacteria in the air. Maybe I don't know. But yeast actually has a function in bread. What it's doing is that flour. You think of flour as it's a carbohydrate. Other things are carbohydrates, like simple sugars, and you can actually taste them. But if I took a spoonful of flour, I wouldn't be able to taste anything. And there's a reason for that. It's a very complex carbohydrate. We need something to break down that carbohydrate so we can actually start tasting the different flavors of what's in the flour. And that's exactly what yeast does. Yeast feeds on the starch, which is the complex carbohydrate in flour. And once it's living in there, it starts breaking it down into some more simple sugars. And that's why we can taste certain flavors in bread that you really can't taste in any other product. The yeast is doing its part. And while it's doing that, it does very important things as well, such as when it's in your baking product, it extrudes carbon dioxide. And that's why it rises. You have a living thing you can think of as the bread as this big balloon. And the yeast inside is basically eating the flour and basically giving off carbon dioxide so it starts to bloom, like this guy over here who I made in the morning. You can see he's probably doubled in size since I last saw him. So yeah, these are the 4 major ingredients. This doesn't mean you can't add other things to the bread, but we're just going to go over the basic bread recipe, and later on we can go over what else can you add to bread to make it more of what you want to make it. Oh, and this is the big thing. Lots of people use measuring cups, which In real bakeries, they don't use measuring cups. They have scales. They measure things because I could take a cup of flour and it would be 3.5 ounces. And then I could take a cup of flour another day and it'd be 5 ounces. And while that accumulates, you're going to get lots of different results. So you're never going to have consistency, which I have an issue with. But you can do what you want. I mean, I guess measuring cups are simpler. But if you have a scale at home, I recommend that you use the scale for all things. I memorized all like 4.5 ounces of flour per cup, 8 ounces for water, 7 ounces for sugar. So then when you're making your thing, it's very quick of like what you're supposed to have. Molasses is 12 ounces. It's so weird. Anyway. So the observant, some of you might have think, like, well, if we're making flour and the yeast is giving off some really good flavors because we're allowing it to live inside, why don't we just have yeast in there all the time? Like, it could just be making all these flavors the whole time. And this is what all bakeries do, actually. They always have this thing called a pre-ferment in the back of the bakery so that they have a consistent flavor quality of their bread. And pre-ferment is very, very basic. It's exactly what I was talking about, some flour, some water, and some yeast, just so the yeast can live in its environment. And so when I want to make another loaf of bread and I want a certain flavor, all I have to do is take some of this pre-ferment, maybe like half of it, and stick it in whatever, the rest of the dough and the water that I'm using, so that I can get those flavors in the dough like it was fermenting for a long time. So really nice bread qualities. The pre-ferment develops flavors, and one of those flavors might be sourdough. I guess it depends on the yeast strain that you're using, and it depends how long the pre-ferment has been sitting. There are some bakeries in like San Francisco that have had the same pre-fermenter sourdough starter for like 60 years. And they just keep it in the back, and this is a very specific yeast strain, which makes basically sourdough why it tastes like sourdough in San Francisco. If we brought that yeast strain over to like Boston and we tried to make like San Francisco sourdough, it wouldn't survive because the yeast is in its natural habitat. So we have a certain yeast strain here, and we have a certain yeast strain in San Francisco. Actually, a funny point, this thing I made here, I was in my backyard in Rhode Island, and basically what I did, I got flour and I got water, and I stirred it together, and I put it outside for like 6 hours. Then I brought it inside, and then I waited for it to do something, and it turned into this. So I actually got yeast from the outside. I don't know if that's sanitary, but it worked. So yeast is everywhere. It's not just like where you buy it in the grocery store. It didn't develop the best flavors, but hey, it makes some bread. So it's pretty good. And you want to keep on recycling the flour, because if you just let yeast grow in there all the time and you forget about it, then things are going to smell, especially in the fridge. So you want to keep on recycling it. So basically every 4 or 5 days, I think that's right, you want to basically take everything out of there except a little part of it, and then refill it with flour and water so that you can get back to the same level. Because the yeast will develop some really nasty flavors if it sits in there for like a week. You don't want that in your bread. OK, so we're going to go through the process of making a loaf of bread. Fortunately, we don't have an oven here, so we're not going to actually bake a loaf of bread. So I brought some bread for you guys. I made that last night. But let's go through the process, and if something comes up that you're confused about, or if maybe something like a cool fact, I'll say it. But let's start with the dry ingredients. So when they mean dry ingredients, they mean flour, salt, and yeast. So I usually just use active dry yeast or instant yeast. It works really well. I don't need to bloom it, they call it, which is basically stirring it in water and sugar so that you can see the yeast work before you actually put it in the dough. You don't really need to do that, unless you're using like fresh yeast, which you probably won't find around here. But anyway, I have this very basic yeast. And just for the time being, since this is not actually going to become a loaf of bread, I'm just going to pour things in. I'm not even using measuring cups. Just, you can judge me. OK, so we have some flour, have some yeast. Now, there's one mistake that lots of people make, and it never says it on the recipes. So you add the yeast. And then you add the salt, because you need to add the salt, and I can get some measuring spoon here. But don't add the salt on top of the yeast, because remember, the salt is a retard for the yeast, which means that it'll kill the yeast. So if you put the salt right on top of the yeast when you're starting to mix, it's very possible that your bread will not rise. So make sure that when you add the salt, it's on the other side of the bowl. So we stir this together, la-da-da-da-da. And that's a very basic step. Get into some more complicated steps later. OK, so add the wet ingredients and stir. So remember when I said when you add water, it binds together because the gliadine and the glutamine are mixing to form. So I have some nice water here. And I'm not going to measure it because I didn't measure the flour. But we'll get it to some kind of state. Something you should also note, some recipes say you should add eggs or like butter or whatever because you're making a savory dough, maybe like a brioche or a challah bread. And you say, so you can just add it right when you're adding all the wet ingredients, which is totally false. The reason why is because, remember, we need the gliadine and the glutamine to mix so we can form that gluten and we can make the dough strong. However, what is insoluble with water? Fat. So if you add fat, it's going to get in between the water and the proteins, and it's not going to let the gliadine and the glutamine mix to form gluten. Or it'll just take you a longer time to knead the dough to actually get what you actually want. So always, always add the water first, mix it, maybe do a little kneading, and then eventually incorporate the egg or the butter or whatever fat you're using later on, so you can get a better development of the gluten. So I'm just going to add this water. And I'm just doing this by touch again, so it's probably some measure recipes. OK. And one common mistake that a lot of people make is they add way too much water. Actually, no, add way too much flour. Because they think like, well, I need to knead the dough, so I should have it in a state before I knead it so that it's dry and that I can actually work with it, and so it's not getting on my fingers. From the experience that I've had for baking for the past 8 years, you want it to be really sticky when you start kneading the dough. And I guess it's just based on how well or how comfortable you are kneading dough. You can use a standing mixer a little bit if you want, but again, I prefer hand mixing. But you want it to state that it's sticky, it's getting on your fingers, because as you knead the dough, the starches are going to basically soak in the water. And so it's going to get less dry over time as you knead it. And as the gluten forms as well when you're kneading the dough, then it'll become less dry. The result, if you add too much flour, the dough becomes stiffer, and it's not going to have the volume that you want. So be careful of adding too much flour. You can always keep on adding water and flour back and forth, but then it's just going to get out of proportion of how much yeast and salt you put in. So just be careful, I guess. So I have a nice-looking loaf here. And I'm going to plop it on here and show you how to knead the dough next. So, I mean, you can use a standing mixer. It works. I've used it before. I don't prefer it because I just see it go in a circle, and then it gets caught on one of the dough hooks, and it just keeps on going around in the circle. And it's actually not kneading the dough. It's just having like a fun time in there. And so it doesn't. What you actually want to do when you knead the dough is you want to develop the gluten. So remember I said the gluten was a strength. It's what binds everything together. You can think of gluten as an elastic band. And to make that elastic band stronger, or to be more like flexible, and you need to stretch it out a little bit. And so if you think of each particle of gluten in the dough as this elastic band, or many elastic bands, then kneading is basically making a network of those elastic bands so they're all entangled with one another. And what that actually does, it creates a network of all these different elastic bands that basically form on top of one another. And so when the yeast produces that carbon dioxide, the reason why it rises and it just doesn't get outside the dough is that you have all this gluten that's kind of like entangled with one another so that it actually rises with it and doesn't let the air out. It's the same reason why when you're baking, when you're baking in the oven, there's something called oven spring, which is like in the first 5-10 minutes of baking, the dough gets really, rises a lot. And the reason is because all that carbon dioxide in the dough, when you heat it up, it expands. So it expands, the dough expands, and the gluten holds it in. So the gluten gets raised while it's expanding. And the same thing with the water in the dough as well. So water, there's water in this dough. If I heat it up, it's going to produce steam. And steam is basically gas, and it rises. So as the steam rises, the gluten catches it in this big network that we've created by kneading the dough, and basically create some volume with our bread, which is what we want. And you can kind of see, can't really see very much, but if you look at this, you can see how it's kind of non-uniform, and that's the gluten network that has basically trapped all of the air and moisture. So I'm going to bring this out on a kneading table and show you the two types of kneading. Do it on here, actually. So everybody has their different style of kneading. I have two different styles that's worked for me for the past 8 years. And I actually learned this up at King Arthur Bakery, or the King Arthur place up in New Hampshire, which is really, really cool. You guys should check it out. They have classes like on sourdough and whole wheat bread, and they make like everything there, the flour, so it's incredible. So the first one is more for like the very wet dough. So if you want to make something like this, it's going to be more wet. If you want to make bagels, it would be more dry because it's going to be tougher. You can see it's a little wet. It's still sticking to my fingers. So what I'm going to just do, I'm just going to take it from the side, from both angles. You can't see it that much. So I'm basically in the middle of the dough. And what I want to do is, if you think of those elastic bands, the gluten, you want to stretch them. And I'm going to use the table in order to stretch them. So I'm going to put the bottom half on the table, and then I'm going to stretch the top half over it. So that stretching action is what develops the gluten. So you just want to keep on doing that process. So stretch, over, stretch, over. And each time I do this, each time I hit it on the table, it develops the gluten just a little bit more. And I would have to do this for about 10 or so minutes before you actually see the very smooth, the top starts to get really, really smooth, and that's when you know it's done. There's not like one formula to say how long you need to knead the dough. It's kind of more like a touch thing. The more you do it, the better I understand when you're done. This is not done. So this is one technique, and this is my favorite technique because I like to make more breads like this than the really tough stuff. So if you guys want to check this out later, I can show you more up close of how I do this. So the other technique that is more suitable for like really dry doughs, where it doesn't really get on your fingers as much, I'm going to add some flour to make it more of a dry dough. Okay. It's the same thing. You just want to stretch it, but the dough might be so strong that it's just not. When you hit it on the ground, it's not working. So what you want to do is you just want to stretch it out right from the top. So you take the palm of your hand and you just push it, and you can see that it stretches this side here, and then you just want to fold it on top of the other one. So stretch over the top, and it gets this stretch here. So you just want to keep on doing that, and they usually say like form like a 45-degree angle. So each time you do it, just 45 or 90. I'm sorry, but I might see you don't even know my angles. Okay, so you keep on doing this, and you can see it's starting to form a little bit better. And so yeah, that's called developing the gluten. You want to knead it for about 10 minutes. And again, what that does, it makes the gluten stronger so that it can hold more air in and have more volume. And also, when you're baking, you want it to rise up. If it doesn't have enough strength to have that volume of rising up, it's going to rise to the side. Which, I mean, if you want like a flatbread or a focaccia, then don't knead it as much. But if you want an actual thing with some volume, then you're going to have to knead it a little bit more. Don't worry about over-kneading the dough. Some people think like, oh, if I knead it too much, then it's not going to come out right. If you're kneading by hand, you can never over-knead the dough. It's like if you're in a factory with these huge like dough hooks that are just mixing it for like hours, or I don't know how long, then you will have the risk of over-kneading the dough, but not at home. at all. So don't worry about that. Overkneading the dough basically like kills the gluten. So if you think of like if you stretch the elastic band too much, it just becomes all flimsy and like limp. And then it won't hold the air in there because it's just very weak. So yeah, don't worry about that. It's developing the gluten that's already in there too. So if I'm using a flour with only a certain gluten content, and I have enough water in there so that it's not as, if I had less water in here, it would be less, or it would be more stiff, then you would have that problem. It's a combination of things, I guess. So the point you stop is, they call it like, it needs to be pliable and elastic, which means that you don't want it to like hold it here and have it fall into two different things. You want it to be a single mass. There are a couple tests that they have, which actually I don't use anymore, but if you take the dough, actually this one might be better for doing that. This has been rising for about a couple hours now, which is a little bit over what it should be. But let me take this one. There's something called the window pane test. Have you guys heard of that before? Okay. So I kneaded this a little bit, and it's risen. So let's see if I can do the window pane test for you. So I just want to take a small piece of the dough. And the test is that if I can basically work it out to be thin enough so that it doesn't break, but I can hold it up too light and see through, then it's done. And since this has been rising and I've already kneaded it, it should pass the window pane test. So you can kind of see, like, you can't really see it actually, but I can stretch it and it's not breaking. It's still holding together, but I can hold it up too light and see the light. So that's the window pane test. So if it passes the window pane test, you know it's done. If you're really, really cautious, there's also another technique of kneading called Autorise. Basically what you do is, instead of kneading right away, you could mix the water and the flour together, or the water, flour, yeast, salt, and let it sit for like 20 minutes before you touch it. And then when you come back, you only have to knead it like 50% as much. You don't have a lot of time. You can use hotter water, like 110, 120. That's what they say in some recipes. That's just so that they know that yeast rises variable to the temperature that it's at. So if it's at 110 and the dough says, and the recipe says rise for 1 hour, it's probably right. But if you put 60-degree water in there, then it'll probably rise for like an hour and a half. There's some function. So the hotter a dough is, the faster it's going to rise, because the yeast is going to work faster if it's in a harder environment. Or if you get too hot, you can kill the yeast. Like 140, you don't want to be at 140. It's usually 110 to 120, I think. I'd have to check that again. But yeah, I mean, I just put room temperature water in. If you really need, like, if you only have like an hour and a half, and the dough says, or the recipe says like bake for an hour, you can raise the temperature of the dough and have the dough rise in a very hot environment. Like maybe you can preheat your oven for like 200 for like 10 minutes and then shut it off. So it'd be like about 150-ish. You can put your bread dough in there and have it rise in there, and it'll probably kill the time by half. But the thing is that if you rise, like, the point of rising is so that the yeast can feed on the sugars and develop the really good flavors. So if you're cutting your rising time, then you're not going to develop the really good flavors that you want in your bread. So, like, sure, if you don't have time, then do that. But if you actually want to make a very like good quality with lots of like flavor profiles in the dough, then you want to have as much rising time as possible. There's some recipes that use a pre-ferment, and it's like this recipe takes 2 days. Some recipes are like a single day where you have like 3 different rising periods, just so you can get those really nice flavor profiles that it would take like 5 hours to make. Oh, the shelf life of flour. So, I mean, it has a very long shelf life, and the reason behind that is, in order for things to like start growing in your food and like things that you don't want in your food, it needs to be in an environment where bacteria can grow. And I remember learning this in culinary school. You need to have some kind of sugar, you need to have some kind of water, you need to have like some sort of temperature, some danger zone temperature. And in flour, there isn't any water. So theoretically, nothing can really grow in there if there's no water. There might be some like little traces of water in there, but not enough to actually have an impact. And that goes for all foods. It's why kind of like oil doesn't go bad, because there's no water in oil, so nothing can actually grow in there. And then we wanted to have it rise for an hour again because we want to develop those flavor profiles. And after some recipes say that you should punch down the dough and have it rise for another hour. You could punch down the dough, or you could also do something called folding. So the idea is, like, OK, so you have, again, those elastic bands that are surrounding the yeast who are developing these carbon dioxide, so it's starting to get larger. But sometimes you want to just relax the yeast a little bit and then start it over again, because maybe like if you just rose it too long in that one state, then it might not work out as well. So so folding the dough is you take the dough. I actually already kind of did this, but once it's risen, there's a lot of air in there, and there's something called punching down, which is basically just trying to get out all of the air or the carbon dioxide that was formed during the rising period. And then we want to do that one last final stretch. Remember, when we're kneading, we're trying to do the stretch. So the folding is basically just folding the dough over itself once, like single time. So you do like this, and you can see that it's definitely more workable than this dough because it's been rising, and I kneaded it before. So it's definitely more together. So I just fold it over like that. And now we have both edges here that are being stretched out. So more gluten development. And after you do this, you can do it a second time if you want, kind of fold it out and form it down here. After you do this, then you need to have it rise again. So you just put it back on here and maybe rise for another 45 minutes. Since yeast is growing in there, it's going to rise faster after a long time. So the first rising period might be an hour. Second rising period might be 45 minutes. Depends how much yeast is in there and how much carbon dioxide it's producing, what temperature you have it at. So shape the dough. So after you do the second rising, if the recipe calls for a second rising, it's very possible that it might not. Then you want to shape the dough. There's lots of different ways of shaping dough, and I can do some for you right now. I'll just go over the basic ones. So the first one I'll go over is, I won't go over the braid right now. That would be too intense. It's like a baguette. So the baguette has, the long form. And there is a specific dough for baguettes, but the shaping is basically the same. So let's take half of this dough. This is kind of large. Yeah, the bread will not be this size. It rises a bunch when it's in the oven. So don't be afraid if your dough looks small. So you kind of just want to flatten it out into a rectangular shape. And so just to get the baguette shape, you just want to roll it over on top of itself. So I have this rectangle, and I want to take the far edge, and I just kind of want to roll it over and then press down. And I'll do the same thing. I just keep on going, the same motion. Now I just use this back edge. Do this, and then I push it down. And you keep on going until you get to the edge. And then eventually you have something that looks in the shape of a baguette. Again, I guess the purpose of shaping bread is so you have most of the tension at the ends. So it's smooth and it's nice, and you want to have that shape. You don't want to have it all raggedy. And so I want to have the same thing with the boule, where the outside is going to be nice and smooth and firm like that. You can do it just by using the friction of the surface of the table and just kind of moving it closer to you. And as you do this, the underside gets tucked underneath with the friction of the table, and you kind of just keep on moving your hands and turning it. And eventually, on the top, you'll have a nice enough, smooth enough, a nice smooth surface that you want. You want to have something like that. The epi is really cool. I wanted to go over the epi because I already have kind of like a baguette. So I just want to roll it out so that it's long. And I did bring scissors. So an epi looks really complicated, but it's not really. I'm sure people can do it better than me, but you just roll it out. You can do this with any dough. And you cut, and then you move it to the side. And you keep on doing this action. And it kind of looks like leaves a little bit. And so when you go to like a really nice bakery and they show you this, you'll be very impressed. And I didn't do it that well. But you can make some really nice artistic shapes just by using a pair of scissors and some dough. It's pretty cool. One last, and you can also just braid dough, and I'll show you that in the last one as well. Cut this guy. So I just want to get 3 strands. And actually, I did the braid for this challah bread here. I used 4 strands there. Actually, I can maybe use 4 here too. So I have 1, 2, it's not rolling out too well. And 3. And again, if you fool around less with the dough at this stage, once you get it right out of the rising, it'll roll out easier because the gluten is not as strong. But as you keep on moving around, it's going to get stronger. So that's why I'm having a little bit more difficulty with this. 3. And 4. This is probably a little bit thicker than what you want. Sometimes what you can do is you can roll out 1, and then let it sit, and then try to roll it out again after you rolled out all the others, and it'll be less tough, because the gluten had a little time to rest. It's not going to be as strong as it was. So I'll just roll these out one more time. Okay. Proof of concept. So to braid the dough, it's very, very easy. And you can make things like these. So you just want to have 4 dough strands. You can do this with 5 also, next to each other. Probably want to add a little bit of flour because you don't want the dough strands sticking together, sticking to themselves as much, because it's still a sticky dough. It's actually better to do with a dough that's less or more dry. So if the dough's more dry, it's going to be less sticky, and you can do more cool things with shaping. It basically stands up better. There's actually a recipe for shaping dough that just adds more flour. So the idea is you just want to have one side be 3 and one side be 1. Have some of my friends who are girls that say it's just the same thing as braiding hair, which I've never done before. So I guess it's, if that was needed better, that wouldn't have happened. But so it's just, you have 3 to one side, and you take the outermost side, and you stick it right next to the one side. Okay. And so once you have that, now you have 3 on this side. It alternates. So, and then you have this one on this side, and then you just want to take the outer one on the 3 side again. You just always take the outer one on the 3 side and stick it at the second, the slot right next to the 1. You don't go over the 1. So you just keep on doing that. And so now I have 3 on this side. And go over, 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 over. And if one is longer than all the others for some reason, you can just cut it off. And then you have a basic like braid. It's exactly what I did for this. And if you have more of a dry dough, it'll work better and it'll get a better shape for you. Make the bread in the oven. There's something called oven spring, which is exactly what I said before. The first 5 to 10 minutes, you heat it up. And again, when I said like the yeast works at a faster pace when it's hot, the same thing happens here. So the yeast starts really like working really, really hard and produces a lot of carbon dioxide. And so the dough expands really fast. And also the steam pressure from the water that's inside the dough gets evaporated, water gets evaporated, produces steam. So we have all these things working together, making the dough, creating air so that the dough can rise, as long as we had the gluten network in there first so that it can actually catch that air and basically boost itself up. And if you don't have the gluten for some reason, you can use pans so that the dough can stick to the sides as it goes up so it can use that strength. The oven spring ends when the top of the dough starts hardening. So like I said, gluten is a protein, so it coagulates just like all the other proteins. So once you get it to a certain temperature, it'll become hard, and it won't do anything anymore. It'll be very, very, no more flexibility. So when that happens, which it happens at the crust first because it has most exposure to the oven, once that happens, it doesn't rise anymore because it's going to hold it. It's not going to let it out anymore. And so that's the end of the rising period. So after like the first 10 minutes, it's not going to rise really as much at all. So the first 10 minutes are very crucial. Some people say don't open the oven door because you don't want the steam to get out, which is kind of true. You can have your own theories. And that's basically it. And there's ways of testing whether the bread is done. If you're really, really cautious and you don't know what it's supposed to feel like, you can take an oven thermometer. And it should be reading about 190 to 200 in the bottom of the loaf. If you've been working with bread for a while, you have something called the hollow test, where you can pick the bread up and you can tap on the end or the bottom of it. If it sounds hollow, then it's done. What I usually do, I just usually pick it up because I know that it feels lighter once it's done baking. It's just I have a certain touch. Maybe once you start baking for more, you can feel it and you can understand that, yes, this is done. I mean, using these principles that I've been saying, you can make a lot of different things, not just bread. And like I said, you can make scones, and you can think like, well, a scone should be nice and tender, so maybe I shouldn't develop the gluten as much, so maybe I'm not going to stir it as much. If I want a really tender cookie, I mean, I've had scone recipes that say just mix it until it's just about like together, just so it's not falling, like totally falling apart. Don't mix it anymore, don't touch it, because they don't want any more gluten development. So there's reasons why these recipes say these things, and there are different baking products that have certain qualities that you should look for, or maybe if you want to get certain qualities out. Like bagels you should knead for a longer period of time because there's more gluten in the dough, or you want to have more gluten in the dough. You want to have more development so that you can make the bagels. Same thing with pizza. Pie crust, you don't really want to have a chewy pie crust, so don't try to develop the gluten at all. Croissants. Croissants are actually very cool. If I explain this very, very quickly. You know how it's really, really flaky? Does anyone know why it gets really, really flaky? Butter. So yeah, the way you make croissants, sorry if this like basically makes you not eat croissants anymore, but you get this layer of dough, like you just spread it out, and you put a layer of butter on there, pure layer of butter, and then you fold it over one another. So then you have a layer of dough, butter, dough, butter, dough, butter. And then you keep on rolling it out, and then you keep on putting it over one another. And so butter is 20% water, so that once you bake it, that water in there is going to evaporate, and it's basically going to splinter that dough, that really thin layer of dough that you have. And so you're going to get these really, really like cool layers within the croissant. It's a very different way of baking bread, but croissants are very cool. Very tough to make. Popovers. And here's a couple books I recommend. If you have any other questions, I think my time's up, but I'd be more than happy to answer any of them. Thank you.